It's the action, point no relaxing. Straight from off the rails with your host, Mr. Patrick. Show we attack, then defend and react. Calculate the damage, then resolve in a snap. Facts with this here and Ember Blade, leave no witnesses. I just close the combat chain and we winning this. Listen, this a blaze, we ain't going scar for scar. And I'm feeling like a hero, we ain't going card for card. It's the action, point no relaxing.
Hello everyone and welcome to The Action Point. I'm your host Patrick Shaw, and today we're joined by a very special guest. Mara Faris has been in the Flesh and Blood scene for a while now. You may know her for her art and alters at Blackwing Studios. She shot into the competitive scene at US Nationals with an iconic limited game on stream and making day 2 that weekend. Since then, she's been one of the more visible faces of Dromai in the community. Most recently, you can see her competing in 983 Media's Goliath Gauntlet 2, where she won her opening round match against Bartosz Ziemba, and she just so happens to be my pick to win the whole damn thing. Mara, thank you for joining me on The Action Point.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Now, I wrote this afternoon, and just before I got everything settled in here, I realized that your match with Tarek Patel premiered just a few hours ago, and the match itself just got over. 18 hours of Dromai versus Oldham action. Unfortunately for us, you were my horse, and you went down, unfortunately, but that's okay. Give me your reactions now that the match is out there, facing Tarek into Oldham.
So yeah, it's a brutal matchup, really. It kind of comes down to like how the Oldham decides to play it. If you're in a timed round and the Oldham tries to kind of push a more aggressive line, you're actually pretty favored into that matchup. You're able to just kind of push more damage, even through poppers, and I'm sure we'll get into kind of the way the deck kind of works around poppers a lot. Oldham's gonna do what Oldham's gonna do sometimes, and if they decide to just block, then you're in a lot of trouble. It's a little rough. The deck plays well into most stuff, but just like because you're on redline, it's one of the few things that like you don't have access to some of the tools that Big Dragon Dromai has for dealing with redline. Like you don't really have good access to Ghostly Touch. You don't have access to Tomultai. You don't have access to Vincerakai, and and more notably the Vincerakai Dust of the Red Desert, the ash that removes Phantasm from Vincerakai. So setting up the big Vincerakai turns is a little hard. You do still have like the Nourishing Emptiness is actually a really good tool into that matchup. And that's usually kind of your Vincerakai replacement is like typically you'll want to set up instead of the like Miragai Chromai Vincerakai pitch stacks that you'll set up in regular Dromai, you'll set up like the Miragai Chromai Nourishing Emptiness. But Tarek read it really well. Tarek played it perfectly. He had the staunch responses for both of my Nourishing Emptinesses.
It was killer to watch it happen when he did both of them too.
It was just as killer to play. I mean, really well played on his part. And he and I even talked after the match, and he was like, "I saw you pitch deck the Nourishings," and immediately had to start setting it up and like planning for it. So he had them exactly the right spots. He had them when he needed them. And really, really well played. Tarek played the game very, very sharp, very crisp. Just play it super efficiently, block as efficiently as possible. You know, I know it's probably not the most exciting game for people to watch, but it was well played. And congratulations to Tarek. And I hope he does well for the rest of the event.
Right now, he's got to win it all to avenge you. You can only lose to the winner now. And Tarek, I think, has some potential in this game. As it is, I think he's going places.
I think he's won a tournament or two. I seem to recall, like a Pro Quest, I think, or something real small. I don't know.
Maybe he's a little goatish.
Yeah, a little goat. Yeah, it's fine. Tarek 2 belts. I think.
Yep. Good old Tarek 2 belts. Friend of content creators everywhere. He's an excellent conversation as well. All right. Before we talk about the deck that we are here to talk about, give us a little history of Mara in Flesh and Blood, if you don't mind.
So I've talked about this on a couple other podcasts, so I won't go super in depth, but I kind of got into the game almost by accident. So yeah, as most people in the community know, I do art and I do altars for a living. And I've been doing that through Magic the Gathering for a little over a decade now. And then after COVID and all the kind of like all the tournaments shut down and all that sort of thing stopped, I was kind of looking for a way to sort of branch out my finances and my market. And there was this game called Flesh and Blood that I just kept hearing people just kind of talk about, and I was like, I don't know, it's not for me. I'm not interested. I don't want to play another game. But maybe I should just learn how to play it just so I can talk to clients. I can maybe see about kind of branching out this market. And so I learned how to play it with absolutely no intention of getting into the game. And that was my doom. I fell in love with the game from day one. I literally I learned how to play the game. I didn't even get a finish. Like I got the like Ira deck intro. Didn't even get the finished intro. Like we got through like half the game, had to stop. Then I got through half of a game with a real deck where somebody handed me a Control Katsu into a Bravo. Got through about half of that game and had no idea what I was doing. Had to stop. And then that night was the Farewell to a Welcome to Wraith draft.
Sure. Yep.
And I've been a big limited Magic player for a long time, and so like some of my friends were like, "Come on, it's fine. You'll figure it out as you go. Just come draft this game that you've literally never played." So I showed up. I built Go Tall Dorinthia because I didn't understand how Go again works. So it was just single Dawnblade attack Dorinthia, and went 2-1 in that draft somehow. I still feel really bad for all my opponents that I beat. But yeah, and then after that, like the rest is pretty much history. I fell in love with the game. The first ProQuest season was very shortly after that, and I just kind of fell right into that, and then just the competitive scene from there. And yeah, I've loved the game ever since.
Excellent. Now, you've taken, not to minimize your contributions prior to, but I feel like you kind of had a breakout with U.S. Nationals. And you've been kind of in the testing weeds for a long time now. We share some of the same circles when it comes to some of the Discord testing areas, so I've seen you really dive into it, but you seem to be constantly testing and working on statistics relevant to your deck, and I've heard you talk about your spreadsheets and things of that nature. How far down the rabbit hole are you in at this point when it comes to analyzing your deck here?
Oh my gosh, I could write a dissertation on this deck. Because if we're gonna start getting into it, I think the really big thing. So like I've been, I was on Prism for the longest time when I first started playing the game, and then after Prism LL'd, I just kind of went straight into Dromai. And so I've been kind of working on Dromai since day one. A lot of the cards that you see in Dromai, like I kind of at least had like some hand in. Like I was one of the first ones to really start pushing like the Mage Master Boots tech, and some of that. So I kept playing the builds, and I kept kind of refining the list, and everything just still felt off. Like I kept looking at this list, and like everything just felt like there were just all these little gnawing inefficiencies, all these little things that I'm like, okay, well, why are we running these cards? Like, you'd have turns with the standard Dromai lists where, you're running like the tomes, and then you're like, okay, I have these things and they do really powerful things, but they put me in these really awkward situations. Like you'll have a turn where you're like, oh, I draw a tome, but like I have a card in Arsenal that I don't want to get rid of, but now because I have the tome, I kind of have to force myself to figure out how to play a turn to get rid of the Arsenal so that I can Arsenal the tome, and then hope that I can have my next turn to kind of take advantage of it. And they always just felt kind of awkward. Same thing with just like you're playing this deck where like you have this secondary resource in your Ash, and even still you're running all of these you're running like all of these blues, and you're deck's not built to play around the ash. So then you end up really struggling with your ash a lot. You end up running, I mean, the fact that most Dromai decks run 6 copies of Sweeping Blow, which is not a good card at all. That card is real bad. That card's just real bad. But like, you have to run 6 copies of it because you need the ash. Like, there are so many worlds where you're just like, pitch a red to play a blue Sweeping Blow for 1 damage. It's a 2-card 1. But like, that's what the decks needed to do. And then like, you're spending on these dragons, and then you're wasting action points. Like, the deck almost universally ends its turn without using its action point. And it was just all these little things that just kept gnawing at me. And I was finally like, all right, I'm fed up. I took the entire deck, ripped everything apart, and was like, I'm going to go all the way back to the drawing board. And I just went through card by card, and I was like, okay, why is this card in this list? What does this card do? What can we do to make this deck feel efficient? Like, I think the biggest part was kind of realizing that, like, I sat back and I was like, what does it make Dromai good? What does it make Dromai a strong deck? And I was like, okay, well, I don't have big dominated crippling crushes. I don't have 30-point Art of War turns. I don't have these big disruptive Channel Lake Frigid turns. The thing that makes Dromai a strong deck is my cards are just better than yours. Like, just hand to hand, card to card, every card in Dromai is just more efficient than every card in any other deck. Like, you look at just like a standard dragon, like you can look at like Asvalai. Asvalai is effectively 5 points of stats plus a point of arcane for 0 resource, and comes with built-in go again. So like, Asvalai becomes a 0 for 6 with go again. And then that's assuming that they kill it as efficiently as possible. Like, that's insane. And he's a purely mediocre dragon. Like, he's one of the just mid-tier dragons. So like, I when I was building the deck, I just kind of went through and I was just like, okay, how do I make this deck as efficient as possible? And that's kind of how the Empress Dromai deck was born.
All right. And I actually think that's probably a good time to transition over to the deck itself, and we can start talking about it. Let's take a look at some of these equipment. First off, the headpieces. So I guess what makes the Empress Dromai kind of stand out the most, I think people look at the Crown of Dominion in its gold token generation at the beginning of the game. But that isn't necessarily, you're not running this all the time. So talk about Crown of Dominion and Crown of Providence as your for your headpieces here.
Yeah, so absolutely. So this is kind of part of where the deck got its namesake, because everybody was talking about Crown of Dominion, calling it Royal Dromai, and so this was because it runs both crowns. I decided I wanted to kind of one up the Royal Dromai, and this is Empress Dromai.
All right, okay.
So the thing I kind of found with this list. So first of all, you'll notice there is a Crown Dominion. There's no cash in. There's no tricks. There's no weirdness there. It is purely for ash efficiency. Crown of Dominion is essentially a once per game Sweeping Blow for free, because you can pitch 2 cards, generate 2 ash, and then draw a card. So you essentially spent 1 card to gain 2 ash. So it's this kind of like, I don't want to run Sweeping Blow in the deck because Sweeping Blow is just a very inefficient card, but being able to have that kind of on-demand once a game as needed is a really nice kind of pressure release. And so what I found in testing was, usually if you're going first in the game, you can afford to kind of take that first turn to make a really inefficient turn where you're just like, well, I'm just gonna pitch to play one of my 1-drops and then throw a card into the furnace to make another ash, and then you can usually end your first turn with 2 ash and an arsenal. And that feels totally fine. Feels really good. Like that's the way you want to start most games. Is like if you can start a game with 2 Ash and an Arsenal, you're pretty set. And so like when I was going first, I was like, well, I don't really need the crown because like I say, I can get 2 Ash and an Arsenal 95% of my hands and feel fine. But when I'm going second, because the deck wants to be very aggressive, like it is much more aggressive than your standard big dragon Dromai. I think it's probably even a little bit more aggressive than most of the other redline lists. You can't afford to take that turn to be like, I'm just gonna spend my turn making a couple of Ash and then trying to do some setup. Like if you're going second, you really want to come out of the gates swinging. And that's where Crown of Dominion really, really shines. It lets you take that first hand and just pitch whatever the 2 worst cards in that opening hand are. Like usually, like the 0 cost dragons are usually not great to start the game with, because they're Ash negative. They're going to eat your Ash. Whereas like the longer the game goes, the better your Ash tends to get. But those first couple of turns, you usually don't want to see the 0 cost dragons. Or like if you happen to draw the 1 of Phoenix Flame in your opening hand, or like a couple other little awkward things, it lets you just start your first turn just going, I'm just going to make 2 Ash and have a 3-card hand, and then just start the game full throttle, right? And because the way the deck is engineered to use Furnace, even if you're like, well, I have a pretty good hand that I don't really need to pitch to, and I just want to play a 4-card hand, you can still go play my 1-drop, pitch a card to Furnace, make 2 resources, and then just crack the gold with the 2 resources from that. And then you still get to keep your full 4-card hand and still set yourself up for your Ash. So the general play that I found is essentially that if you're going first into most matchups, you want the Crown of Providence, and if you're going second, you want the Crown of Dominion.
All right, excellent. Flamescale Furnace seems to be a pretty self-explanatory staple into Dromai. The Snapdragon Scalers, on the other hand, I've seen a lot of phantasmal footsteps. That is one of those feels clunky kind of moments. Snapdragons seems like the appropriate pick here, but justify some Snapdragons here for us.
Sure. I do want to quickly touch on the flame scale, because I think that was another one of those things when we were talking about the efficiencies.
Mm-hmm.
You see a lot of the Dromais that just use the flame scale as a way to make emergency Ash for a deck that's not built to generate Ash well. Like you'll see a lot of just pitch a red into Furnace, make an Ash pass turn. That was another thing when I built this deck. I was like, Flamescale Furnace is an incredibly powerful tool for this list. And I wanted to really, really build the list around being able to abuse that extra resource that you can gain. That's why you'll see stuff like the Nourishing Emptinesses and the Command and Conquers, and even like I have Samaya in the main list, which is usually a sideboard card, because I can get so much more value out of it because the deck is built to abuse the Flamescale Furnace.
Excellent.
As far as the Snapdragons go, I don't think there's much argument that Snapdragons are just probably one of the best pieces of footwear in the game. Like they're just incredibly strong. They set up some incredibly powerful turns. And this deck is built to abuse them. This deck runs all of the cards that you really want to see with Snapdragon Scalers. Yep. It runs Snatches. It runs E-Strike. The E-Strike 5 draw a card, go again is just an incredibly powerful line. But then it also has like a Dust Up. Dust Up is a fantastic card to Snapdragon because you can Dust Up, get all your go agains, and then also attack with that extra dragon, the Ashwing that you get. Like you can essentially turn Dust Up into a 5-power attack that also leaves an Ashwing behind for them to deal with. And even just like Miraging Metamorph, nobody expects a 1-for-7 with go again. That's always like just a really strong way to start a turn. And the deck runs a fairly small number of Chain Enders, but you do occasionally can still get those hands that are just like, this hand has 3 Chain Enders. I have like a Snatch, a Dust Up, and an E-Strike. And if I didn't have Snaps, then that hand is going to be like E-Strike, 5 draw or 5 go again, and then your snatch, and you're like, well, I had a 9 damage turn. It's okay, but with the snaps, now you can suddenly like strike 5, draw a card, go again, play your other draw cards, play everything else in the hand, and then still end on the snatch, and it cleans up those turns a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Snapdragons just lets the deck. I don't want to say funky. Like it lets the deck just hedge on those little, stumbles, those little awkward turns, and just cleans things up and sets up some very, very powerful plays.
Now, Snapdragons and aggro cards is something I can relate to. So, in most Briar builds, you're looking to use Snapdragons on like a big turn, right, to set something up to make a card that wouldn't have go again, right? Continue the chain when you want to channel Mountain Heroic. If you're into Phi, for instance, you're usually snap it. You're usually breaking it at almost the first opportunity to gain any value out of it because it's almost incidental. Where does it lie in Dromai? Are you looking to specifically set up that E-strike, draw a card, go again, or are you using it? Are you using it the first time that you can gain some value out of it, or somewhere in between?
Somewhere in between. I am more likely to try to hold it like for those kind of awkward turns where like I usually don't want to just like, if you just have the first snatch, like I'll see a lot of people that are just like, oh, drew my first snatch, I'm just gonna open with the snatch, draw card. Something that you'll see with this deck too, one of the other really big perks of the deck being entirely redline is card draw becomes terrifying. And even blind card draw. Like I love using both snatch and E-strike 5 draw as chain enders because I know that I'm not going to draw dead. Like, you play a lot of like Briar, and it's really hard. Like, it's very risky for Briar to play Snatch as her chain ender because she's going to risk drawing like a tome or something. And then she's like, you're like, well, this is bad. But because the deck is so dense in threats, it's nearly impossible for you to draw bad on just an empty chain. And so even or on an empty arsenal, so people have to respect your card draw even if it's a chain ender. And so because of that, you don't actually need to waste the snaps on the early snatches and on the early E-strikes, things like that. And it lets you kind of hold them for that really good turn. You get that one turn where you're like, man, this hand could be okay, but if I can set up the snaps here, I can throw like an 18, 19, 20 damage turn. And that's where snaps really shines in the deck.
Yep. Excellent. Last but not least, the arm pieces here. You ran Iron Rot into Tark. You have Silken Form in the sideboard. Talk to us about where you run these.
So there's not a lot of secret. Arm pieces for illusionists aren't great. We don't really have a lot of really shining examples of good, powerful arm pieces. So the Iron Rot tends to be the go-to for most things. And admittedly, when I first put it in the list, I was like, there has to be something better. I hate playing this. And then the more I played it, the more I was like, no, this actually just kind of does exactly what the deck wants to do. Because the deck doesn't want to block a lot. The deck, my card, my average card is just worth so much more being played than blocking.
Yep.
So having just that one extra block can get you so much value, especially in this world of breakpoints, right? Anytime that you can come up against a Phi and you can single card block a Snatch with just like a 3 block and the Iron Rot, or you can block a Mask Trigger because they Phoenix Flamed for the Mask Trigger and you can just free block and stop the Mask Trigger, gets just so much more value than even I kind of expected in the deck. I've seen some Dromai players run Wave of Reality in the slot, and I hadn't been impressed with Wave. It does effectively gain you 2 life instead of the 1 that the Iron Rot does, but because you really don't have any control over it, especially in, like I say, this deck that doesn't really want to block, it's probably just going to get broken on the first turn on just whatever the first thing they throw at you is. And I'm pretty firmly in the camp of if I can Iron Rot to block a Snatch, I have already gained infinitely more value than the one life that the Wave of Reality would have provided.
Sure.
So I'm pretty firmly in camp Iron Rot.
Iron Rot's a good card.
Yeah. The Silken Form. Yeah. So the Silken Form doesn't do a whole lot of work in this list. The Quell is a lot less exciting when you're running almost entirely Redline. But the couple of things it does do really well. So you'll notice that there is no actual Arcane Barrier in this list.
Yep.
And thankfully, most of the decks that you need Arcane Barrier against can't meaningfully interact with Ashwings. Like Icelander and Kano both don't kill Ashlings very well, and so essentially the Silken Form is your 1 point of AB that just also gets to attack. I will say, like, against Viscerai and against Briar, against the Rune Blades, you don't usually really want to be pitching for AB in those matchups anyway.
Yeah.
Like I will say, if you're in a meta and your meta has just a ton of Viscerai specifically, I would probably swap out the Silken Form for an Elrune Glove just to kind of hedge a little bit, because Viscerai is very efficient at killing Ashwings and also throwing a bunch of AB. But again, like I say, usually if you're having to pitch for AB, you're probably not winning that game anyway. But it's a decent hedge if you're more comfortable with that. The other matchup that I actually really like the Silken Form into is Dorinthia. Because Dorinthia likes to go over the top by exactly 1 really regularly.
Yep,
that's like one of her
that's very
favorite
good.
lines.
Yep.
And because Quell is the last thing on the turn, because it's just damage prevention, you can Quell and then she loses the ability to respond to that. So just by having it on the table, it means Dorinthia can basically never go over by 1. If she goes over by 1, you can Quell and then the reactions are done.
Yeah.
So it's actually very efficient in that matchup specifically for that reason.
Excellent.
Other than exactly that, you usually don't want to be pitching entire cards to Quell though. But one card to shut off a Dorinthia turn is just fine.
Makes perfect sense. All right, that is the equipment. Let's move on. All right, so before me now is the 60 card main deck of Empress Dromai. Let's talk about some of the aggro staples here, just conceptually, and then let's talk about some of the cards that separate this from other Dromai lists.
Sure, absolutely. So yeah, you'll see a lot of the standard aggro staples, especially in a list like this, because it's a redline list. Like Ravenous Rabble is an absolute must. The card is just one of the best cards in the deck. It's always fun when I can just play Ravenous Rabble and then just tell my opponent, be like, this is 4 damage, and then flip over the top card. It's a good way to mess with their head.
Oh yeah, I didn't mean to bury the lead here. So this is the 60 card main deck. There's not a single blue card in this thing. This is 100% red cards.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, the main deck is entirely red, and really built to make that happen. Like I said, we talked earlier about how a lot of the bigger Dromai decks aren't built to really engage with that Ash generation. When you're running these big expensive dragons, they're really neat, but then like you're pitching blues, and when you're pitching blues in this deck, you're hurting your Ash economy, because your Ash is a resource. Like, it's just like, you wouldn't play an Oldham deck with all reds. Like, you can't, because you have to keep in mind your resource curve, and that Ash generation is part of your resource curve for this deck. And I think is actually one of the things that most people really don't understand about Dromai, in particular with like building Dromai lists, is you kind of have to look at any Dromai list and be like, okay, how many cards in this deck are Ash negative, meaning cards that lower your Ash total when you cast them. Cards like your 0-cost dragons are Ash negative. Rake the Embers is Ash negative. Skittering Sands is Ash negative. And you kind of have to compensate that by saying, okay, how many cards do I have that gain me Ash when I cast them? Cards like Miraging Metamorph is great for that. Your CNCs and your Nourishing Emptinesses and those kind of cards. So like you have to be able to find that balance, and it's really, really important when building a Dromai list. No matter what kind, whether it's a red line list or just a big dragon Dromai, you have to always kind of keep in mind of how many cards do I have that make Ash and how many cards do I have that are consuming my Ash, and you have to balance that properly or you're going to end up in a lot of trouble.
For sure. Dan Rakowski on Fi, coming into US Nats and eventually Worlds, made a lot of got a lot of hype out of Flame Call Awakening getting the Phoenix Flame, so that things like Enlightened Strike could be free to tuck under there. You used this combination slightly differently in your list. Tell me about Flame Call Awakening in the flame here.
So I will straight out say I think Flame Call Awakening is the best card in this deck.
Ooh, okay.
Flame Call Awakening is the card that makes this deck feel cohesive. It's we just had Belittle banned for its power level. Flame Call Awakening is Belittle in this deck and then some. Flame Call Awakening is more powerful than Belittle. Like you'll see, there is no Belittle in here, but there is Flame Call. Flame Call Awakening allows you to open a turn with a 0-drop, of which there are plenty. There's lots of zeros. Then pitch a single card, play the Flame Call Awakening, make an Ash for it, search your deck for the Phoenix Flame, attack for 3. Then you can pitch the Phoenix Flame to the Furnace. Again, we talked about this deck just really being revolved around abusing that Furnace power. You can then pitch the Phoenix Flame to the Furnace, make a second Ash, and then net 2 resources. So you have a very common line in this deck, which is play a 0-drop into a Flame Call into one of your big 2-drops, be it Nourishing Emptiness or Samaya or Command and Conquer. And like I say, because it is a resource positive, a red attack with Go Again that also generates 2 resources, it does everything that this deck wants it to do. It really feels like the linchpin that kind of holds the whole deck together. Like every time I draw a Flame Call in hand, I'm always like super excited for a big turn.
Do you think there's any world where you would increase the flame count?
Probably not. Amusingly, there is another card that I really tested, and all the 5 players are going to kill me because I can never remember the name of it because it's the bad one. The 1 for 4 that picks up a Phoenix Flame from your graveyard gets Go Again. That's the one.
Yep.
I looked really, really hard at that card, because that card in a list like this does kind of exactly the same thing that Flame Call does, where you can pitch your 1, attack for 4, and then you can put your opponent in this position where you're like, okay, I've played my zeros, right? And then my hand is now just the Stoke the Flames and my 2-drop Chain Ender. And I can go, here's a 4, I'm going to make an Ash, and then if you block it out, I'm going to Arsenal my CNC, and you just wasted a really awkward block. So like I'm just going to happily claim my efficiency there, keep my CNC in Arsenal, and then do it again next turn. And then if you don't block, then I can pick up the Phoenix Flame, immediately pitch the Phoenix Flame, make my 2 resources, net another Ash, and then come in with my big 2-drop. I looked at that card real hard, but there is just no good way to get the Phoenix Flames in the graveyard for that to work. Not without just running like 3 Phoenix Flames, and even then, every time you're playing it, like you just want to pitch it. You never want to like attack with the Phoenix Flame in a deck like this. So there's like even if you had the 3 Phoenix Flames, then you're playing them just as 0 for 1s just to put them in the graveyard so that you can put them back in the deck, and then they're back in the deck, and then when you draw your next card to get them, then you can't get them anyway. So it just didn't work out. But
That's
I think aside from somebody cracking the code on that card and figuring out a way to make that happen, the one Phoenix Flame's all you ever really want. You really never want to draw the card. It doesn't block, attacks for 1. And then the nice thing about running the 3 flame calls is that you can, as long as you find 1 flame call before you find the Phoenix Flame, that Phoenix Flame is going to live on the bottom of your deck for the rest of the game. Flame call is the only shuffle effect in the deck. So the only times you are ever shuffling the deck is to put the flame call on the bottom of the deck. So it's really nice. You very rarely have to worry about drawing it. So yeah, the one feels pretty much perfect, I think.
Excellent. Going into the dragons, it looks like you've picked the efficient of the crop here. I think the standout in this is is Themai. I think everything else I think we would expect in a Dromai list, but Themai has been either excluded or in the sideboard in a lot of them. So talk to us about Themai. Am I saying that correctly?
Yeah, it's Samaya. Yeah, it's
right.
pretty much. I think that's correct. So yeah, as we kind of mentioned, you'll notice that Samaya is in the main deck, and partially because of the way that this deck is built. So normally Samaya is very awkward in most big dragon Dromai decks because again they're not really engineered to be pitching those reds. So like you never want to pitch 2 reds to play a Samaya. That feels miserable. But if you're pitching a blue to play a Samaya, now he's an Ash negative card. You're hurting your Ash economy, and you're ending up with this one awkward floating resource that like the Dromai doesn't have a lot of ways to use one resource that's not play another dragon. And if you're pitching a blue to play 2 dragons, you just lost 2 Ash, and you're probably hurting for Ash pretty bad. For this deck though, he's like he feels so much better because you have those 1-drop into 2-drop lines that we were talking about, and so he's just another one where like he's now only costing me 1 card to pitch rather than having to pitch 2 reds or pitch a blue. I can pitch 1 red to Furnace, still keep my Ash economy, and because he's a 2-drop that then has go again, I can play my 1-drop into 2-drop and then still end on one of my 0-cost chain enders like the Snatches or the Dust Ups. So he actually fits this deck a lot more cleanly than he does in most other decks. And then the text is just sometimes icing.
Yeah. No, the text in particular, because it's they can only do what does Themai do again? Let's find out. Opponents can't play. Yeah. Play cards or activate abilities during your turn. I mean that becomes more and more relevant in the top tiers here. It definitely has a chance to shine. Miraging Metamorph gave me nightmares in Prism, and I was happy to see it just not being used. And now you have it here. It's terrifying. You talked a bit about having just a 1 for 7 is an incredible rate. You can break Snapdragons with it. Tell us more about Miraging Metamorph in this list here.
I will say, as a former Prism main, every time I play a Miraging Metamorph without Go Again, it hurts my soul.
Mm-hmm.
But even still, it's just another card that, like I say, we talk about. Just every card in the deck needs to be efficient, and that's the thing that's always, I think, really tricky to do in Redline specifically because any card that costs 1 is essentially costing you 2 cards. So you look at like the 1 for 5s, you're like, well, that sounds like a great rate in Oldhim. 1 for 5 would be awesome in Oldhim. But in a Redline list, that's a 2-card 5. So like you're ending up very far below rate.
Mm-hmm.
Miraging Metamorph, however, spending 2 cards to do 7 feels great. Like that's a completely solid rate. Like it feels good. It's a lot of damage for 2 cards. And then the fact that it is also an Ash positive play just helps, again, like we were talking about with that Ash economy, with making sure that you have more cards in the deck that generate ash than you do cards that consume that ash. So having Ravishing Metamorph as a card that is both a very efficient chain ender and also an ash positive play feels really strong. And then we do like the Phantasm, if it's broken, copy Aura text isn't wildly relevant to the deck, but does actually come up because we lean very heavily on Burn Them All for a lot of damage in this deck. And because we're redline, we can keep those Burn Them Alls for a very long time. So it still makes your opponents kind of think twice about whether or not they want to be able to pop this if they're going to give you a second Burn Them All.
Yeah, second burn them all does seem very dangerous. That particular interaction does seem to gain a lot of publicity. How often have you actually been able to create a new burn them all?
Pretty reasonably. Like, it doesn't come up super often. I say most opponents are pretty hesitant to want to do it.
Right.
More than anything, it's a nice deterrent. It's a nice way to say, like, hey, you can pop this if you want, but you really don't want to. But it does come up every now and then.
In Prism.
Yeah. It does come up every now and then. It does come up often enough. I had a game once against an Oldham a couple of weeks ago where I had 5 Burn Them Alls in play going at once.
That sounds terrifying.
It was pretty great. It was right at the end game too, so I had like 30 reds because again, you're red line, so like I just had like 30 reds in my game and I was like, all right, these are sticking around for a while. I hope you enjoy arcane damage.
Before we go into the sideboard, is there any other cards that you want to bring up that we haven't that you'd like to talk about?
I think Nourishing Emptiness might be the only. Oh well, actually, the Nourishing Emptinesses are.
You have it listed in the sideboard.
Yeah, they're.
I know you talked about it a lot so far.
Yeah, we'll come up to those in the sideboard then.
Okay.
They're in a lot of matchups. They're one of those cards that's kind of like sort of a sideboard, but sort of a main deck card. But yeah, we can talk about those in that. There are 2 cards, technically 3 of note, that are not in the deck. That I think might surprise a lot of people who are used to some of the other redline decks. And that would be Doombreaker Senpai, and also Spears of Surreality, and Red Hot. The Red Hots I think are fairly self-explanatory. I like Red Hot. I really want to like Red Hot. It's a fun card.
That's a quick step back. I like that. I like it. I want to like it.
Yeah, it's a fun card, and like the ceiling on that card feels great, especially in Redline where you're just like, I just flip over everything. They're all reds. But really, the best that card's ever really gonna do is a 2 for 8. Which sounds great, but like we have a 2 for 8. It's just it's Ember Moss Senpai. So I don't know why we would really ever want to play a 2 for 8 with like a substantial drawback that's really hard, rather than just play Ember Maw. Which, for the record, Ember Maw is not in the current list, but feels great in the list. I actually ran one Ember Maw over one of the Nourishing Emptinesses at Indy because I was expecting a little bit more aggro. If anyone's tuning the deck, if they want to swap out any of the other 2 costs for Ember Maws, totally fine. But
could you see yourself? You talk about the 2 drops being kind of the finishers here. Is there anything that you might would you add the 2 drops without subtracting a 2 drop here somewhere? Is there potentially a slot for 3 more 2 cost cards?
Probably not. Like you could maybe do 1 or
stuff too much.
Yeah, like see, like a lot of the numbers in this deck are very precise. We talk about having the spreadsheets. Like I have just math and hypergeometric calculators for everything on this list. You can add 1 or 2 more 2 drops, but it kind of starts to hurt your efficiency a little bit because you really like if you draw a hand that's like 0/0/0 drop, that hand becomes very awkward to cast that 2 drop. Like you never really like. As a general rule, if you are pitching 2 cards to play a 2 drop in this deck, you probably messed up somewhere or you chose the wrong line. it happens every very rare now and then. Like there are some times when I'll draw those 0/0/0/2 and I just really need to cast that 2-drop, but it feels miserable every time. And adding more 2-drops kind of makes it slightly more likely that those hands happen. So I tend to be a little bit hesitant to add too many 2-drops.
Fair enough. All right, I'm going to clean this up and we'll get into the sideboard.
Yeah.
All right. We're back and we're looking at now the sideboard. But before we get started on the sideboard, Mara, you wanted to shit on a card. Please, shit on a card.
Okay, if I'm allowed to. So my hatred for Dunebreaker Senpai has become a meme in my local community, because I really hate that card. Really do not like Dunebreaker Senpai. And its little brother Spears of Surreality. Specifically in the red line lists, we talk about wanting these very efficient plays and these very powerful plays, and spending 2 cards for 5 damage just isn't it. Like really, like at its core, spending 2 cards for 5 damage, I would probably have just rather blocked with those 2 cards and prevented 6 damage. But really, on top of that, the other thing that makes it so bad, so it makes me really hate the card, is the lines that it forces you to take. This deck really, like I say, we talk about wanting to go that 1-drop into 2-drop, or like play your red starter to turn on all your go-agains and your Blaze Headlongs and your Flame Call Awakenings. So like if you're running Dunebreaker in the deck, you have to open with it really most of the time. And because that card has Phantasm, if you open with it and they happen to have their popper in hand, your turn is just done. Like you just spent your entire turn to do nothing. And that's just an unacceptable level. Even in the decks, they're like, oh, well, it's only 5. They only have 3 poppers. Sure, but if that 1 popper lines up with that 1 turn and you just lost an entire turn against a Phi who's going to go 3 turns for the whole game, like that play probably loses you the game on the spot. Mm-hmm. And then you see a lot of the other red line lists. We talked very briefly about Phantasmal Footsteps not being in this deck. And it's for exactly that reason. If you're running the Doombreakers, it forces you to sacrifice Snapdragon Scalers, which is, again, one of the most powerful cards in this deck, for a piece of equipment that does very little. Like, you're never really blocking with it. You're never really doing anything with it. It's only there to give you insurance for those Doombreakers, which we've already established aren't even great cards to begin with. Mm-hmm. And even then, you go, okay, I pitch a card, play my Doombreaker, they pop it. Now I have to pitch another card to activate the Footsteps. So now I just spent 3 cards to do no damage and take 1 card from my opponent, and I have 1 card left for my turn. And it's not great. Like it generates you some Ash, and that's neat, but I'd rather just build the deck to be more efficient on Ash and not need the card. It puts you into too many bad situations, and its best case scenario is still just a 2-card 5. And it's just not worth it.
Well, you've sold me. I'm burning them all. Speaking of burn them all, your sideboard here, we start with Nourishing Emptiness that you've talked about a lot, and the interaction between Burn Them All and Nourishing Emptiness has gained kind of a lot of traction, and is kind of one of the, I think, gets eyes on the deck almost as much as the Crown of Dominion. Here, seeing the Nourishing. It is in the sideboard, but you just talked about that. It's in a lot of different matchups here. Mm-hmm. Tell us about where you would be playing this, where you wouldn't, and why it's here in the first place.
So like you said, the Nourishing Emptiness is really there because they have a very favorable interaction with Burn Them All. Burn Them All already just one of the strongest cards available to us in this deck, especially if you can get them down early. Because the deck is redline, you can keeping Burn Them All in play for 6, 7, even 8 turns is not unusual for this deck. So that the amount of damage that card represents is already very high. But then it allows us this extra benefit of being able to strip all of the attack actions out of our graveyard. And then usually once you can get a burn them all to about like 3 to 4 counters, you've probably reached a point where you are just playing your attack actions for a turn and then immediately banishing them out. So your graveyard is almost perpetually empty for most of the rest of the game. And from there, the nourishings are pretty self-explanatory. It's a 6 dominate that increases your intellect. It's just a back-breaking play. And there's a lot of decks. There's a lot of times where you can play a Nourishing Emptiness and then go into your next turn with with a 5-card hand plus an arsenal, and the game just feels over at that point into a lot of matchups. It's really a fantastic card, and it's in a very large percentage of the matchups. Usually the swap that I'll make is between Nourishing Emptiness and the Miraging Metamorphs, because they kind of fill that same chain ender spot. Okay. The Miraging Metamorphs are a little bit easier if you're in a matchup where you think you're going to have to block some. Because again, the Nourishing Emptiness, you really want to have that 1-drop into 2-drop, and you need a 4-card hand for that. And because you want the nourish or the burn them alls, you want the games that are going to go a little bit longer. So they're not terribly great into decks like Fi, where that game's only going to go like three or 4 turns. You're probably not going to have time to really set up the burn them alls, which means the Nourishing Emptinesses are not going to be online. So you usually don't want them there. You know, some of the other matchups, if you're worried about the match going very fast, like if you're going into a dash and that dash is just full Teklo Pounder, I'm going to just smash your face in, they're probably not great there. But like any of the matchups that are even just like a little bit slower, like, you know, I run them into a lot of dashes. Like if the dash is going to go like pistol plan on me, I'm really happy to have them there. I'm happy to have them into Briar even. And then they really shine into matches like Oldham, you know, where that match is just gonna go long, and you're gonna be able to set them, to have plenty of time to just set them up, and especially like if you're looking to go long, like Oldham or Bravo too, same thing, where you can really set up these big Nourishing Emptiness turns and get a lot of power and be able to push, like I say, and then be able to push a lot of damage all at once to when you can set up the 6-card hands. If an Oldham is trying to really block you out, it becomes a lot harder for them to do when you're like, cool, I have a 6-card hand that's going to end in another dominate that draws me another card. So yeah, they're in a lot of matchups. They only mostly come out against Fi, and then they come out against Icelander because I tend to just cut most of the 2-drops into Icelander just because you kind of have to play around the disruption, and the 2-drops can be a little awkward there.
Fair enough. I will say I think the Burn Them All and Nourishing Emptiness is probably one of the more unique interactions that I've seen. So, you know, props to you for figuring it out. It's
definitely one of my favorite things about the deck. I know when Dromai first came out, I had seen a couple people playing with it in kind of cutesier lists, but it doesn't, like, because you can't really run it in Big Dragon Dromai because you can't Burnish Blues. It's actually one of the things you have to be careful with the blues in this list, because, you know, you'll notice there are a couple of blues in the sideboard. I cannot run any attack action blues because I can't banish those. Like if I'm in a position where I have to cast one of my blues or I have to block with one of them, I can't Nourishing Emptiness for the rest of the game because you can't get rid of it. So, you know, it fell out of favor very quickly in the bigger Dragon Dromai because it just made your blue selection very restricted. But in this deck that already doesn't really need a very broad blue selection and is already wanting to just run a bunch of reds, it was a really perfect fit.
That makes all the sense in the world. Moving on to Sand Cover, you know, if I recall correctly, this might have been one of the toughest decisions that you've made in your deck, is the 79th or 80th card being the second Sand Cover. Talk to me about saying, because you had one for a little bit, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, the defensive options in this deck have been all over the map. Like we talked about a little earlier, like I had Oasis Respites in here for a while. I've had Arenia's Prayers for a while.
Wow. All right. Sure.
Yeah, the very early iterations had Arenia's Prayer.
Red cards.
And then the more I played, the more I found that I just really actually didn't need the defenses against the wizards, against the arcane. And it's even funny here with the sand covers. Everybody kind of assumes that I'm bringing them in against Icelander, and I'm not. I don't even bring them in against Icelander at all. Where they're good for is Bravo and Dorinthia. Bravo in particular, they're very, very strong. And Oldham too, to a lesser extent. If you think the Oldham is going to go on an aggressive plan. But having the ability to put a sand cover in Arsenal, and then if they throw like a CNC pummel, like it just so elegantly works around the entire CNC pummel. You can block 6 and then sand cover from Arsenal and, ignore basically all of the text of CNC. It's great. Same thing, it gets around all the dominates. Against Dorinthia, it's just another 4-block D-react. The only thing that I will say about the sand covers is in the matchups that I'm bringing in sand cover, I am usually taking out skittering sand.
Okay.
Because again, we talk about that ash economy. Because you're adding another card that is an ash consumption, you want to take out a card that does the same. If you're just bringing in more ash consumers into this deck, you're gonna start struggling on that ash a little bit harder. So that's the thing you kind of have to keep in mind with sideboarding.
You talk about 4-block defense reactions. A sink below, a staple everywhere. You have it here. But it is in the sideboard. So where is sink below coming in?
I don't think there's too much we have to go into on sink below. It's a very efficient defense reaction. This deck does not like to block very often, and you really don't want to be blocking in most matchups. But there are a couple of times where you just really need to. Fi specifically, you need to be able to stop the massive momentum triggers. And it gives you a very clean, efficient way to do that, even if because Fi will very often like to throw a 4 on that third chain link because it's hard to block. And you have your armor to block, and that helps some too. But having that just one extra, that you can kind of tuck in Arsenal in case you need it is nice. Same thing if they're playing, Snatch. And this goes for like Briar too. Just those really tough, awkward break points that have really powerful on hits, things like Snatch, and then Force of Nature and things like that. So it's a nice card to have access to. It only comes in a couple of matchups, but in those matchups, I'm usually glad to have it.
Absolutely, I think especially when it comes to these super aggressive decks, there's kind of a stigma against things like defense reactions, but Fi and Briar both bring in sink belows against those heroes that like Bravo and Guardian Dorinthia and things like that. The ability to single card block late as an aggressive deck and maintain a 3 card in an arsenal or a 4 card hand is so important and can be game winning when what used to be a Winter's Wail or a Gentleman's Anathos, super late when you're into that kind of 2-card tempo deal. Sink below can easily win you the game here. All right, let's talk about
also Spinal Crush hurts. Spinal Crush hurts real bad.
Yeah,
dominated Spinal Crush not fun. Being able to like spinal and crippling both, like having that extra D-react just feels real nice in those.
Blues all over the place. Well, not all over the place. You have 8 blues total. Are they all coming in? Or do you lump them all together? How are you working your blues here?
So for the most part, like against Icelander, you're definitely bringing in all 8 blues. You just kind of have to. You're actually very rarely even pitching them to the AB. It's not about the AB. It's about being able to deal with the disruption. Channeling Frigid is a real good card when you have nothing but reds in your deck. Same thing with cards like Blizzard and even just one Frostbite for this deck can be a little bit crippling. So you have to you have to bring in at least some blues to be able to deal with those things. And I bounced around somewhere between 6 and 9, and 8 kind of felt like the right number. Like, there's a world where like if the ice decks just got somehow more popular than they are now, that you might want to add a little bit more. But generally 8 feels pretty good. It's usually you'll have one about every other hand. And that's generally reliable enough that like if they play a Channel Lake Frigid, you'll have one for at least like 1 or 2 of the Channel Lake Frigid turns, assuming they're keeping it for 2 or 3 turns. You'll have it for, if you need to pay through a bunch of frostbites or whatever you need to. And then for Icelander specifically, the energy potions and the passing mirages are both actually just pretty good cards in the matchup. Like say the energy potions, if you draw it on a turn where you didn't need the blue, then it's like insurance for a later turn, which is nice. And then the passing mirages, they just have a hard time interacting with. They don't have weapons, so they can either send a whole card at it or they just kind of have to leave it in play. And because the deck runs a non-zero amount of poppers, having that in play it's a nice little bit of insurance when you're sequencing. So this round's on me. Yep. Into Icelander, don't have a lot of text. They're blues that block 3. They do also come in against Fi.
Sure.
I ran a lot of math on this card because
you weren't sold on this round for a little bit.
I'll be honest, I'm still not entirely sold. It's really funny. I put a post up on Twitter when I was like really considering the card. I put a post up on Twitter and I was just like, what do people think about this card? How good is this card really? And nobody had consensus. Like I had several people that were like, oh, the card is absolutely backbreaking, it's super powerful, and people were like, it does nothing and it's irrelevant, the card draw for Fi is way more important. So I literally I grabbed one of my testing partners and I was like, we're gonna just play 100 hands of Fi, the exact same hand with and without this round's on me, and just like I mean this is one of the spreadsheets that I have. I literally have a log of probably 40 or 50 hands of Fi where I'm just like, okay, this is the hand, this is how much damage the hand puts out, this is how many chain links the hand puts out, this is the hand when I play this rounds on me, this is how much damage the hand put out, this is how many chain links they got, and the end result was it's fine. It usually averages, it usually prevents between about 3 and 4 damage, which is kind of right about where you want for a card in the stack. You want every card to have about 3 to 4 value. It was fine. The one nice thing, and the one reason, the real reason that it kind of made the cut in the deck is, it's a reasonably efficient card, but what it does do in the Fi matchup is it does a really good Flame Call Awakening impression, to where you can use the same line that you use with Flame Call, where you can play a 0 cost, pitch a red to this round on me, make an ash, draw a card, then you can pitch the card you drew to the Furnace, and then end off with a 2-drop. So you end up with that same, like, I generated 2 ash, I played my 2-drop for only a single card, and I still got about 3 or 4 points of value out of it. So the card's nice. It kind of helps clean up your curve a little bit into that matchup, and it's fine. If I ever found another blue that I felt like I really wanted in a different matchup, it's very reasonable to cut. I very briefly tested blue Smashing Good Times, just when people were starting to murmur about Dash getting a little bit better. And the card just ended up being a little more clunky than I liked, so I kind of went back to the this round's on me's.
All right.
Yeah, it's mostly just there because you needed one more really good blue for Icelander, and it had use in another matchup, so it made the cut.
Excellent. Passing Mirage, is it safe to say that your Reinhards and Guardians, where the poppers are plentiful, this might go in there?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's just a solid staple against any of the Guardians or like say the Reinhards. I usually don't bring it into the other matchups where I don't have a lot of poppers. Like I've seen people play it into like Briar and things like that, and I don't particularly like it there. They have too easy of a way to kill it, and they don't usually run enough poppers, and I don't really want to run the blue. I much prefer just keeping the deck streamlined to as many reds as I can keep it. It just makes the deck feel a lot more efficient. So
Yeah.
great into Guardian, great into Reinhardt, great into Icelander. Beyond that, it pretty much sits at home.
All right, home stretch. We could do this. We could do this forever. I do want to just touch on matchups. Like, what are your what are your good matchups? What are you happy to see across the table? What do you not want to see across the table?
So one of the things that I actually really like about this deck is its matchup spread feels a lot less swingy than Big Dragon Dromai. Big Dragon Dromai has a tendency to have these like 80-20 matchups and then a bunch of 20-80 matchups. Like if you've ever played Big Dragon Dromai into Fi, that one's rough. That one's real rough. And this one, I think, still manages to maintain those really favorable matchups. Like I feel very strong into like Icelander. I feel very strong into Lexi. I feel very strong into Oldham, unless they're gonna hard fatigue, and they should probably not be trying to hard fatigue you in a 50-minute tournament. They usually just it's pretty tough for them to get that done. So like if they're gonna try and be aggressive, you feel pretty favored there. I feel really good into the other aggro matchups that aren't named Fi. Both Briar and Dash are getting pretty popular, and this deck has a tendency to just kind of outvalue both of them. They're just like, I'm gonna throw cards at you, and I'm like, I'm gonna throw cards back at you, and my cards are better than yours. Briar can still always kind of hit that high roll, and sometimes that's just Briar's gonna do Briar things. But the fact that this deck doesn't hiccup nearly as badly as Briar, like it's very rare that you have awkward hands with this deck. You play actually very similarly to Briar. I've actually been slowly converting all of my Briar mains to this deck, because you play a lot like Briar, except you don't have those turns that are just like 4 non-attack actions and 3 of them are blue. Just because the threat density is so high and the curve feels so good. I feel really solid into most of those matchups. The only matchups that I ever really flinch into, Bravo feels pretty about as close to a 50-50 matchup as I can get. I feel pretty good into Bravo, but like Bravo, like it just depends on what the Bravo draws. Like if this deck doesn't really want to block, it can block better than most of the other aggressive decks. You have a lot more 3 blocks than most of the aggro decks.
Yep.
So like you can block really well, but you don't really want to. Like it's not what you want to be doing. It's not your game plan. So if you go into a Bravo and he just hits the just runner, Spinal Crush into Crippling Crush into Terra Sunder, you can survive that, but at kind of the cost of some of your game plan. So Bravo, just kind of depending on how he draws, feels very close to 50-50. If you can just come out of the gate swinging and hit him really hard and kind of put him on the back first quickly, you feel pretty favored there. But then if he comes out with just his big smashy, you can struggle a little bit. Fi is the only other one. Fi has always been kind of the bane of Dromai. Just because of the way Mask of Momentum interacts with dragons. Fi can be tough. But even still, this list where Big Dragon Dromai is probably 70-30 or 80-20 Fi favored, this list feels much, much closer. It's probably 40-60, maybe even 45-55 after the belittle ban. Fi is still going to be a little bit favored just because Mask of Momentum's pretty brutal. You have to be very careful when you're playing dragons in this list. Against Fi, you usually want to either play a whole bunch of dragons all at once or no dragons at all. Playing 1 dragon a turn is going to get you killed. You kind of have to look at every hand and just know that the first dragon I play this turn is going to net me 0 value because he's just going to get a free Mask of Momentum trigger on it. So like if I can play 2 to 3 dragons back to back to back, then I'm like, okay, I'm going to lose value on the first one, but these other 2 are going to be really big threats and he still has to spend a turn dealing with them. Or if I'm playing 0, then I can rely a little bit more on my armor or maybe like a single block to stop the Mask of Momentum, as opposed to having to spend like 2 or 3 cards and then also lose my dragon.
Sure.
So yeah, fight can be a little rough, but it's still like you just, stay aggressive, stay on top of him. Your average turn is still just better than his average turn. Like you're gonna actually get you will usually get a pretty substantial life lead early against Fi. And then usually it's the big Art of War turn that can kind of catch him back up.
Yep.
So that's where Fi kind of can come ahead. Is Fi gets just a really big Art of War turn, he can kind of catch up all of that value that you've made over the course of the game. If they don't find the Art of War, or if you can just get really far ahead before he finds the Art of Wars, you can still do a lot of work. But like I say, that the dragons and Mask of Momentum you just have to be really, really careful about when you're playing that matchup.
Sure. All right. That is going to do it for this episode of The Action Point, featuring the Empress herself, Mara Faris. Mara, sorry about that. Thank you for coming on. If you have, I want to know where we can find you, your links, your plugs. Give us your socials.
Sure. So I'm pretty active on the Flesh and Blood Twitter. It's just at Blackwing Studio on Twitter. I've got, if anyone still uses Facebook, Blackwing Altars on Facebook, and Blackwing Altars on Instagram. Other than that, I'm pretty much Blackwing Studio everywhere else. My Patreon is Blackwing Studio. I have an Etsy store for anyone interested in picking up custom art tokens. Also, if anyone is looking to ever get custom art or altar commissions, it's just blackwingaltars@gmail.com. And my emails are always open. My DMs on Twitter are always open. I'm always happy to discuss Dromai or art or anything else. Don't ever be shy to reach out.
Awesome. All right. Thank you very much. And
thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. I'm obviously a huge fan of yours, and I'm happy to have you on, and I look forward to witnessing your furthered success in the game here. Thanks everyone for watching this episode of The Action Point on Off the Rails TCG. The Action Point music was written, produced, and performed by Griff. Be sure to like, subscribe, and click the bell notification for new video releases on Off the Rails TCG. You can find me on social media on Twitter @PatSmashGood, and you can find the channel on Twitter @Off-the-Rails TCG. And that's going to do it for us, and thanks for watching. I don't have a clever thing to say these days. I gotta figure something out.
It's the action point, no relaxing. Straight from off the rails with your host, Mr. Patrick. Show we attack, then defend and react. Calculate the damage, then resolve in a snap. Facts with this here and Ember Blade, leave no witnesses. I just close the combat chain and we winning this. Listen, this a blaze, we ain't going scar for scar. And I'm feeling like a hero, we ain't going card for card. It's the action point, no relaxing.